My name is Frederic Berg. I'm Vice President for UI5 Development, Germany. And today I'll talk to you a bit about the benefits of some of the things we've been doing, namely UI5 Evolution. And I'll talk also about something new that we've done. It's UI5 Web Components. And quickly look at, a rough agenda for today, what we'll be covering. We'll talk about UX consistency. It's a major topic at the moment. And I'll try to, explain a bit to you what that means in terms of impact it has on the development of UI5, but also maybe to a larger degree to this company. We'll talk then about UI5 Web Components, talk about some of the aspects of it which are important, like theming, adaptation, and I'll have a larger section on UI5 Evolution like that. So what have we been doing in terms of a technical renovation of our stack? So UX consistency is a really big topic at the moment. And in order to get you sort of into the right mindset of what it is that the company's been busy with for the past probably 1.5 years now, we'll go back in time just a little bit to explain to you what the history is of the UX part of our product. In 2013, SAP decided to invest quite heavily into a new design concept, SAP Fiori. Right? Before this, basically all of the screens that typically were used for SAP applications were desktop-based. So that's the history, that's what we've been doing all along. And as you know, in 2008, the iPhone came out. It had a massive impact to how end users want to work with, IT systems, basically. And so it took a little bit. In 2010, UI5 development was started. And so when this discussion to renovate the UI of SAP came up in 2012 and 13, UI5 was mature enough that this was chosen as the framework of choice to implement the Fiori design. And back then, the main goal was to go mobile, right? It was mobile first, responsive UIs, totally different from anything we've had before. We've had some iterations in between. Fiori 2 came out a few years later. This was to broaden the scope back to desktop as well, to have a refreshed theme, right? And to simply iterate and evolve basically the design concept to make it fresher and to have it really running nicely on all of these device types. And it seems like it's just another renovation what we're doing right now in terms of Fiori 3, but it is not really. And if you listen to Jürgen Müller's keynote Tuesday morning, right, he actually started with this topic of Fiori 3. It was the first topic, and he had this one slide up with all of the different shell headers, the shells of the different products of SAP. It's important to understand what happened there. SAP, over the past 10 years or so, or even more, has acquired a large number of companies. So SuccessFactors, Ariba, Fieldglass, Concur, Qualtrics, and a lot of others. What really was a situation for customers, but also for us, is that all of these companies come with their own technology stack. When it comes to the UI part, they all have their own designs. They have their own opinions of how a UI should work, how to interact with an application. So what's the menu structure, right? How do you navigate in an application? What are the action placements for buttons and things like that? What's the use of colors and fonts and icons? And all of this is totally different in all of these products. So for companies that integrate or that want to run several SAP solutions together, the end users usually face a problem that it doesn't really look consistent at all. So the intelligent enterprise, as the overarching topic these days, attempts to sort of solve this and bring things back together and also create a consistent UI on top. So Fiori 3 is now a result, a new design, an evolvement of the SAP Fiori design concept to cover exactly these consistency aspects to, first and foremost. So the consistency really is about the look, things like colors, typo, it's icons, it's something like metrics and spacing, positioning of elements on the page. So this was sort of the goal of Fiori 3, to harmonize this across all of the different solutions of SAP. And we sat together with the technology guys and the designers sat together with all of the other groups and said, okay, what is really the best way to do this? And we came up with a consistency standard, which is now, applied to all of these products. This has been, sort of the work of the past 1.5 years. Fiori 3 is now available. It's part of S4HANA. It's also available to, customers who are not on S4HANA but have front-end server installation, for example. So it's alive and it's out there. And this is the first time we have such a consistent design across all of these companies. Yeah? So consistency is key. Alignment of some common functions like the shell bar design. This is what Jürgen showed. How to do settings and many, many more things. Right? Ultimately, you should have that sort of look and feel. And I think it became quite apparent in the keynote that most of the streams, they all really look like they come from a single design approach. And this is kind of the idea behind all of this. And the question is, what do we as SAP UI5, developers or development teams have to do with this topic? So what we did in UI5 was we provide this new theme. The theme that you see on the left-hand side for the Fiori 3 iteration is called SAP Quartz Lite. The previous one was Billy's, now this is Quartz. And so we created this over the last year, and it's available, as I already said, now for all of the products that have already used UI5-based UI technology in the past. But what we also did is we looked at a bigger problem in the company, because when you look at the other companies we have acquired, they're not using UI5. And that's because we just bought some of them, like Qualtrics. Obviously, they're not on the UI5 stack, right? And some of the other companies as well, they have stacks that have grown for 20 years or more. So when we meet with these folks, basically the problem is they cannot just flip a switch and be fully on UI5 in all of these products. So somehow there has to be a journey towards a common, consistent UI. And we thought about what is a good way to help them reach this goal earlier. And the good thing is, kind of when we started thinking about sharing some assets with them to enable them on this journey, the web browser platform also evolved quite a bit. Because in the past it was hard to share, let's say, pieces of the screen in a consistent way with others, right? Control or something like this, in a way that is usable wherever you are on the web. But there's a new technology, and it's called Web Components. So Web Components really is a web standard, right? So it's a web standard to create reusable HTML tags to use in web pages and apps. And this really means that you get to create your own HTML tag, and you get to implement exactly how it looks and how it behaves. And this thing you can share with others. So wherever someone is using HTML, you can plug this in, and it runs and behaves potentially like a UI5 control would. We decided to go and create from all of the know-how that we have, from the HTML and CSS that we own, right, and understand, and the behavior, that would be the JavaScript part. We decided to take that, what we have in UI5, and basically put this in a reusable component like a UI5 Web Component. The advantage is that you now have something that you can share with others that already comes with certain features like enterprise-grade qualities, it's accessible, it has screen reader support and things like this, which usually is quite difficult to implement. Here's one example of the code, but let me actually show you where you can find out more about this, and we'll have a look at a quick demo. What you can do is you can just go to a search and go to search for UI5 Web Components. It's an open source project, so you'll find this on GitHub. There is a link right up here that takes you to our entry page for this project. Now, if I zoom in a little bit and scroll down, there's a simple example that I think illustrates quite nicely what we do. So on the right-hand side, you see this HTML tag that we've created, right? UI5 date picker. And if you load the necessary, web component, and you put this in an HTML document, this is what you get. Right? You get a fully functional Fiori compliant date picker that has all of the, functionality available. And I think I zoomed it a little bit too much. So you get to select dates and months and, do all of this stuff. And obviously you see now this is shown up in English, but this is also translated into all different languages and stuff. So it's exactly the same as what we have in Fiori based on SAP UI5, but now we can make this available to basically the company for exactly this topic of UX consistency. Right? If you go to this Get Started section, you see sort of what's available at the moment and how to consume it. It's all done in a way that's pretty easy to consume for a web developer. Right? So you do an npm install of this, and then you have access to it and can use it in your applications. And on the left-hand side, you see the type of components that we already have available. Obviously, simple things like buttons and icons and labels and stuff like this, but also the more complex ones like exactly this date picker or cards, and we'll see what that is in just a little bit as well. So let's go back and look at this once again to understand this and to position this as well, so you understand when to use this and when not to use this. The goal was to share the qualities of UI5 with others for this topic of consistency. We wanted to make it easily consumable, right? To not force someone to have the entire SAP UI5 programming model in place. And we do this using open web standards, right, that are established. So we did not invent the technical concept behind this, but we just sort of upgraded it with the enterprise-grade qualities and so on that we think is important for usage in an enterprise environment. Web components are not UI5. Right? They don't come with data binding. They don't come with all of the functionality around. It's really just a rendering. It's really just a tiny piece. So they're also pretty lightweight, and you can plug them into any website without, affecting performance and things like that. And now this is important. We're not targeting application developers. So for all of you who are now thinking, oh my God, do I have to stop using UI5 for my business applications? And is this important? This is not the case. This is for web developers, and especially for those that maybe also within your companies, if you have projects where you've said, okay, here I have something that is not really a Fiori application. It's more a customer-facing front page. It's something that, or an internal info page or something like this where you say, I'd like to have that in a look and feel that's close to the business applications, but really it's just a website. It's something very simple. I don't need extensibility. I don't need, all of the features that you have with a real Fiori application. Then this might be interesting for you. In short, this technology is really modern. It's supported in all the browsers except IE11. But for that, there's a technical, there's a polyfill basically available to make it run there as well. It's enterprise grade and it's framework agnostic. And that means we're working together with some of these other, groups, as I said. And some of them are using Angular or React or some other technology, maybe server-side rendering. They have JSP still in place in some cases, And so for all of them, this is something that they can at least potentially use nowadays. So I already did the demo for this, but maybe this one slide is still interesting. These are the programming models and stuff. And notice up top right, they are not a successor of UI5, just to stress this. So it's not like we have a new technology and UI5 is now no longer relevant. It's sort of a spin-off, and just brings it into a different context where UI5 at the moment cannot be used for whatever reasons, maybe also for good reasons that we understand. And so when we spoke about this with some of these groups that have been using, for example, React, one of them also created an open source project because they wanted to integrate it in React. They found out that some of the connecting code that you have to write is a bit tedious to implement. And for example, there's now a project out there available also on GitHub. It's called UI5 Web Components for React. So this is sort of an easy consumption layer for the web components in your React applications in case you have something like this. So we see this sort of, ecosystem-based growth around this, which is quite nicely, and we hope that we gain more traction there for especially those use cases where UI5 is not maybe the right thing. Good. And since the positioning really is important, let me stress this once again. Let me give you an overview of, let's say, the qualities and what we have available in the front-end technology space at the moment. If we start at the bottom, there's UI element visual design. That's something like CSS, right? Next one up is UI element behavior. That would be the JavaScript. That's how a control or a calendar reacts when you click on certain elements, right? So if you're on that level, if that's all you want, then UI5 Web Components is sort of the right granularity. If you already think about having it used in a certain programming model of choice, so like React, maybe UI5 Web Components for React is then the right granularity. And then as soon as you need a framework for real business application development, that's when you go to UI5. And now and in the future, that's the right thing to use because this comes with so much more. And the guys in my team, they usually say this arrow should be 10 times higher, right? Because there's so much more in it. It's not just a little bit more than web components, it's 100-fold more, right? So, but just to put that into perspective, UI5 is exactly right for application development, business application development. And you also probably know that if you do not want to build applications from hand, if you don't want to code the UI, we also have some tool in place which is called Fiori Elements. Fiori Elements basically means you actually expose an OData service typically with annotations and metadata. And there's a generic UI component that can read this and create a screen for you automatically. So you don't have to actually code UI5, even though that component is written in UI5. It's for, I would say, for back-end focused teams that rather tend to think about data structures, APIs, and they don't want to really deal with web technology like that. Yeah? So they can use this, and there's plenty of sessions as well on Fiori element development these days. One more example, because I think it illustrates quite nicely how this has been used. This is a screenshot from SAP Fieldglass. On the left-hand side, you see sort of the previous way the screen looked, and you notice how the calendar looks there. It's, you know, it's a calendar like you know it from, I don't know, a hotel booking page or something like this. On the right-hand side, you see how they just exchanged the calendar with the web component. You know, on the right-hand side, to have now exactly this sort of Fiori look and feel in their application. And the rest is still their technology stack. It's not UI5. Good. So we think about, you know, creating more of these web components, having the 1.0 release coming out, and helping also maybe you, if you're interested in this technology, to write your own web components. So these are some of the things we'd like to do now going forward. It says UI theme designer integration, that's an interesting aspect. For those of you who knows what the UI theme designer does or what it is? Anyone? No. So the UI theme designer is a tool SAP has created on SAP Cloud Platform, basically, that lets you as a customer go in and say, I want to change the branding to fit more closely to that of my company, right? The blue and the SAP logo is maybe not for everyone, so you want to go in and change it to red and have your own company logo in. Maybe change the background of the applications to not have the gray there. And that's a tool that once you do it in the UI theme designer, it basically affects a lot of UI technologies all at once. So if you're in an S4 HANA system, for example, we have a number of different UI technologies, but they're all connected to the central tool. So that means one stop, you change the branding, and all of the UIs across all of the different UI technologies automatically adapt. Web components will also do that. And since we just talked about theming and adaptation, there's also something interesting that happened in that space. That's really nice. It's also, once again, going back to this topic of the web platform evolving. Right? So for the longest time, we have themed our applications, or we have provided CSS by just static CSS files. So our developers, they write CSS for each control, and then that gets stored on the server somewhere, and it's loaded when the application is loaded. Now, when you want to change the colors, as I explained with the theme designer, you basically created copies of all of these files, right, and set them right next to it. And that's a process of loading and storing files, and so that was a bit tedious. And we wish that the browsers had ways how you could dynamically change colors by providing something like a variable for something, changing it on the fly. Right? So the cool thing is that when we looked at how to theme UI5 Web Components, we also noticed that the browser nowadays, they support that to a certain degree. It's something called CSS variables. And that's a nice thing. I'll show you in a demo in a second how this looks like. But it basically allows us to create CSS files, which have already this concept of placeholders in it. And the list of placeholders on top, you can change it in the browser at runtime, and directly all of the locations where a certain color like blue or red is showing up, this is changed on the fly. So no more need for CSS pre-processing like LESS or SAS, these tools that web developers use these days. You can kind of do this on the fly, and that's pretty cool. So let me show you how this looks like. Go to a quick demo here. So, good. So this is a web page we've created using UI5 Web Components, with the shell header and some cards. And this is just to illustrate, let's say, the performance of switching these themes. I have a settings dialog here, and I can switch this to black and white pretty quickly. And if I drill down a little bit more into details and actually take a look at what's happening behind the scenes, you have in this HTML document in the head section, you have right here, you have this listing of these variable names and values, right? And you can go in here and change this, and it automatically affects the whole page. There's no need to reload a CSS file for this, right? So this is great that browsers have gone this way. It's not complete yet. They cannot do complex calculations. Some of the pre-processing engines can do 10% lighter, darker saturation and stuff. This is not yet all possible, but they're on the way to get there. And then we think that we can change the entire way we do theming these days with this new technology. So that's really exciting for us, and hopefully provides also a better experience for customers in the future, because it comes with a better performance, because no need to load a megabyte of CSS when you just have to exchange some variable values somewhere in the page. Good. And talking about performance and the main really topic of today, UI5 Evolution. It's something that I've already talked about last year because we've been busy with the evolution topic now for probably 2.5 years. And to put this a bit into perspective, when we had talked about performance issues of applications roughly 2-3 years ago in the teams, we noticed that we're not the only ones. In the industry at the time, it was sort of commonly seen that web applications that have lots of JavaScript run fairly well on iOS devices and really badly on Android devices. And the reason for this is that when you throw JavaScript at a browser, the browser can only use one thread, so one processor core to execute the processing. Right? And while Android devices have 8 or more cores, and each of them is pretty weak because usually the devices are cheaper as well. iOS devices, they have just a few cores, but they're really strong. So that means that running on one individual core alone usually gets you a much better experience on an iOS device. So we said, well, how can we make this better? Because we cannot parallelize this. That's all browser platform. And then we said, okay, let's see what the industry does. And we looked around, and basically everyone came up to just this one conclusion: we have to serve less code to the client. There's nothing else you can do. Like, it's really just the sheer mass of code that affects it directly. The problem was that UI5 wasn't built easily, to serve this purpose, because we had chunks of code that were just too big, and we always had to serve all of them. And then we said, okay, we have to chunk it into smaller pieces, right? Make it more modular, and have tooling in place that checks the application and its required functionalities and says, okay, which code do I actually need to load? And put that together in something like a dedicated bundle that the application gets. So we don't load functionality that we're not going to execute when the application is up and running. Right? So the teams were reworking the code base for 2 years now and doing all of this modernization and creating new ways of writing JavaScript modules and all of this stuff, all of the tooling, ultimately to have a better performance when starting an application and so on. So performance was definitely the biggest reason for us to do UI5 Evolution, but there's another reason, and that is we continuously try to push more and more of what we do in UI5 into the direction of standard technology that the web platform provides. So whereas on the left-hand side, in 2014, we had a lot of topics that we had to code in UI5, we now can rely on some of these web platform standards. And I mentioned web components, CSS variables, and things like this. And so what's important for you as, maybe not being that deeply inside of these topics, what's important to understand is when you're using applications, or when you're writing applications, Fiori applications, and you use UI5 technology, it's not one thing that's been, sort of sitting there silently for a couple of years, because we've been around for 10 years now, but we're continuously, working on this code base. And we do this in a way that's completely backwards compatible. So applications that you've written in 2012, they still run in the latest version of UI5 today, even though the code base has been, upgraded quite dramatically. And that is also something that sets UI5 apart from typical, JavaScript frameworks out there, because that's not their main purpose, right? You build a website once, and then maybe when you want to recreate that page, you just use the latest version of another framework or something. This is not what we do. We abstract, we safeguard the investments, and that's what UI5 Evolution was mainly used for. How can we make the applications better without requiring a rewrite or some sort of additional investment for customers? So I already talked quite a bit about, the UI5 Evolution concepts and what we do. I said the modularization was important, right? To have these smaller chunks that we can group together. I haven't spoken about async yet, and that's important. What we did when we created UI5 8, 9, 10 years ago is we used technology in the browser to fetch files from the server in a way that the browser says to the server, I need this file, and I'll wait until I get the results back before I do anything else. It's a synchronous request. That basically means while that request is pending on the network, nothing happens in the browser. There's no layouting, there's no style, nothing happens at all. It's completely blocked. It's when browsers sometimes freeze, right? This is when such a request goes out until the result comes back. And that's obviously really bad for performance, because sometimes you have subsequent requests, 10 of them. If the latency is 500 milliseconds, you're waiting for 5 seconds for a page to respond, while nothing is happening, in parallel. So what we also did as part of Evolution is we said we will make all of our internal calls asynchronous. so that none of this happens anymore, right? And that saves a lot of time, much more than JavaScript processing takes. Long delays on the network are always much, much more expensive. And while we do everything we can under the hood in a compatible way, yeah, there's a bit of things that also happen in application code, yeah, because we have provided APIs that are synchronous by nature, and we have now provided asynchronous alternatives. Let me quickly show you what this means. If you go on the web and you search for UI5.sap.com, you get to, oh, actually you can just type it up here, right? UI5.sap.com. You get to the entry point of our documentation. And in here we have a search. If you search for async, right? There's a new chapter in the documentation, or it's not that new anymore, but there's a chapter that's called, is your application ready for asynchronous loading? Right? And it lists sort of the topic, what it's all about, and so on. But there's one important chapter in here. It's called Legacy Factories Replacement. Right here, if you go in, you kind of see what this is all about. On the left-hand side, you see how our code, our APIs worked before evolution concepts, where SAP.UI.component is basically a function call. It's synchronous. There is no callback or nothing else. On the right-hand side, you now see the new way of writing this. We now need to tell the browser that we need this component, SAP UI core component. And then once that has been loaded, then the browser goes back. That's the sort of the second function in the component create call. That happens in an asynchronous fashion. And even then, you know, when it's done, the dot then means the next step, again, asynchronously is happening. And that's obviously, you know, a bit more complex to write down, right? The left-hand side looks simpler. And so it's fairly hard to go from left to right if you're an application developer, right? So we do all of this in the framework, but if you need to do this in your application, we've also created something which is called the UI5 migration tooling. In the UI5 migration tooling, once again, it's an open source project from us. It's also on GitHub. You can see the documentation and everything here. Now this basically is a tool that lets you take an application project and have a wizard basically just scan the code and migrate it from the old way of writing to the new way of writing, right? So it takes it as far as we can, probably 80–90% the way, right? To already replace whatever we can do. That means module structure, some of the API calls and stuff. And there are some things where we need your help, right? To tell us what exactly was the code that needs to be in the callback now. A couple of things need to be done by application developers as well. And to make it clear, it's not absolutely necessary that you do this, right? Because, as I said, we stay backwards compatible. None of this is mandatory. But if you do this, some of the applications, maybe those that you've written where, you know, they could be, you know, snappier, that this is a good thing to start off using the migration tooling to help speed up the performance in loading. Yeah? Okay. So next section, tooling. I kind of showed you a bit of tooling already, right? We have the migration topic. We have this tooling that I mentioned that can take the individual modules and create bundles and stuff. So we've invested quite heavily in tooling. And the reason for this is also that in the past we did not have tooling available for everyone. The only way how you could take a custom application and make it sort of ready for deployment was to go through Web IDE. If you use the SAP Web IDE and create a UI5 application project, there was an automatic build step at the end that would sort of put all of the different JavaScript resources and stuff into one individual file for deployment on the server. Now, this tooling was only in Web IDE. You could not get it easily outside of this tool, right? And we hear a lot of web developers that come to us and say, we'd like to have this as a standard command line, Node.js-based tooling that, you know, feels natural to them. And so we took all of our tooling and actually made it available outside in exactly this format. So nowadays it's easy to have an application project, to have a server startup that serves your application in a browser while you're developing, to build the application and have it ready for production all on your local machine, but also you can integrate this into CI/CD pipelines, for example. So all of this is the tooling part that we've been working on. And it's sort of, when we talk about restructuring the code base on the left, the tooling is sort of the topic on the right that needs to fit together, that the whole story makes sense. So Topic progressive is interesting. We also thought quite a bit about how can we make applications, the Fiori launchpad and other things faster, you know, at least when you talk about perceived performance, because we looked at how normally application performance is measured. Yeah? And so normally the moment you hit enter on the keyboard when you type in a URL, up to the point in time when everything is done on the website. That's what typically people say is the end-to-end performance of a website. But there's, you know, a new trend. Google is talking about it a lot, Facebook and so on. They're talking about something called perceived performance. And they say that it's not as relevant when the final thing is ready, but it's how it positions, how it shows itself to the end user that you think something is fast or not fast. Imagine you have a page that takes 2 seconds to load, and you see nothing for 2 seconds, and then everything is perfectly, finished, versus a page that shows you something after 400 milliseconds, a background and maybe, navigation bar. It feels like it's there right away. And then some components come in, right? It's what Facebook does, for example. When you load Facebook, you have on the top, you have the header that's coming in right away, and you have the badge for the notifications. And then, after a while, the rest of the page comes in. So the end-to-end time of Facebook is probably like 10 seconds or something until everything is loaded. The components really are plugged into the page one by one. But you don't notice that this is slow because, something is there. You can already click on elements. It's interactive. And that's exactly what we also try to do with UI5 Evolution, to take these concepts and put them into our products. So we did this with the Fiori launchpad, for example. We worked with the folks that built that and said, can we make it show up quicker in the beginning, right? So that this concept of a first paint, so the first time the browser renders something, is effective. And we were able to, dramatically improve this first loading experience, because you right away have, the launchpad come up and be active. And then the second concept, which is called hero elements, basically says, is there content on your page that is very relevant to the user? And think of the YouTube web player, right? If you start YouTube, the first thing that renders is the player, not the comments and the related videos. That's the thing that everybody's interested in. So if you're on a slow connection, they try to prioritize just loading this component first, even with the rest of the page being empty. That's the thing everybody wants to see. And then the rest comes in. It takes a little bit, right? And so we also try to work around, these concepts to educate our internal development teams. How can we make that a part of the thinking of an application developer? And that means for anyone of you, who are writing applications, if you have sections of the screen that are very important to your user and other components which are maybe costly to load, don't block the initial display, but first load what's relevant and then try to load the rest of the code afterwards, right? Because it's okay. Maybe that comes in 2 seconds later. It's no big problem for the user. So that's progressive loading. The bundling I already explained. And I think leveraging open source, I also talked about this because it's something that we've been, sort of passionate about, to really do whatever we do as an open source project. Everything we've done so far is on GitHub, and you can all see exactly what we do on a daily basis. So the tooling, this just lists sort of everything we've already discussed. Is something, if you just Google UI5 tooling, you'll get all of the different tools that we have available on the page. And I talked about the performance gains, and I want to quickly say this is what we've sort of seen. This first paint, the initial display of, of something that the user perceives as the page being ready, we could, reduce this by 60%, which is quite a lot. Because if you go from, 2 seconds to something like 0.8 seconds, that feels like it's coming up instantaneously. We could reduce the time until the user perceives everything to be done because it's visually complete, right? Maybe JavaScript is still processing in the background, but visually it seems to be done, right? We could reduce this by 50%. And the download size overall we reduce on average by 30%. That's due to the modularization and the tooling, right? So while not all of this is something that you need to do, the session was like, what's the benefit of what we do, right? And that's sort of the indirect benefit all of you get when you're using the latest version of S/4HANA, for example. All of this stuff is already in there, right? And so we continuously try to improve that by just doing more in that space, right? The next slide I'll show has demo videos, right? A comparison between a 2-year-old S/4HANA application and just the latest version. And while the two screens will come up kind of like at the same space, just notice the first paint difference if you look at this. The right-hand side is the new one, right? And I'll go back and do it again. Right? You see the header, the background, everything comes in almost, a second before the left application is even really starting up. So that's one of these examples. And when you see this consistently across all screens, that really gives you an impression of a much better performance. There's a second example as well, where just the processing overall was, it's already done. The left-hand side still loads for another 2 seconds almost, right? So these are some of the effects that we now see across applications. And that's not the end of it, especially for the integration of Fiori element-based applications. We did a lot of around this concept of progressive loading in a way that we try to that we load already all of the code necessary for Fiori elements-based applications when the user is still, let's say, looking for a tile, that he wants to click on to start an application. We use this thinking time of the user to already warm up the system, warm up the browser, have all the JavaScript resources ready, because we can do this in the background in an asynchronous fashion. Good. So let's spend a few minutes on let's say, the key takeaways. I mentioned initially one of the big topics is consistency, UX consistency, and UI5 tries to obviously serve everyone who's been using UI5 as Fiori 2-based customers with a version of Fiori 3 that is fully backwards compatible. And Fiori 3 is available, so if you have, as I said, an S/4HANA system, or not, right? With the front-end server 6.0, you can upgrade from Fiori 2 to Fiori 3 and have all of this sort of Fiori 3-based consistent UX already in place. And that makes you basically ready for an integration with some of the other products of SAP in the future. Openness is important, right? It's important to us, and I hope you also appreciate this part, that we try to share as much of the things that we do with, with the community, with everybody out there, and it provides hopefully pretty good transparency into where we're going. We continuously try to integrate standard web technology, so making UI5 more modern while, safeguarding all of the investments that you have done in your application code. So this is not an old framework, it's continuously growing and innovating. And so that's something to really keep in mind when you have a discussion around what's legacy and what's modern. For us, that's important to always be at the forefront of things when it comes to web standards. And one topic that always gets a lot of discussion points is performance. Obviously, I think you've seen a little bit about what happened in this space of UI5 Evolution, how we could speed up the processing of these applications, and that's not the end, obviously. So we're continuously pushing to do more in that space, but hopefully that's something you'll notice when you come to the latest versions of UI5 in your systems and notice this as well. So this actually brings me to the end of the session for today.